Hello again and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be talking to you about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD, in children and teenagers specifically, but lots of what I'm going to be talking about actually pertains to adults as well. So I think when we first hear the words PTSD, what immediately springs to mind is veterans, soldiers, those who have fought in war-torn countries, and also emergency first responders, so paramedics, police officers, firemen. In fact, up until like the 1980s, it wasn't even called PTSD. It was referred to as battle fatigue or shell shock. But with the more research and more psychiatrists encountering people that had a different mental disorder, it's kind of like it's a combination of anxiety and depression and stress and borderline personality disorder. It's like there's so many rolled into one that they finally determined that it would be best to give it a name because it had very, very specific signs and symptoms. And so the term PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, was born. Now, what's interesting is that whilst post-traumatic stress disorder is listed in the DSM-5, the psychiatric manual of mental disorders, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD, which is actually quite a mouthful, isn't. But what they found was that there were adults, children, teenagers that had the classic symptoms of PTSD plus something more. And so this is how they kind of decided how each diagnosis would go. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a stress response to a horrific, scary, life-threatening, nasty experience that the person has experienced just one time. And so when we think of that, it would be 9/11, an airplane crash, a motor vehicle accident, a shooting, a child or teenager who sees a parent being physically and emotionally and maybe sexually assaulted in front of them. That is PTSD. The difference with CPTSD is that it is repeated and ongoing traumatic experience over a period of weeks, months, years. So think of that as human trafficking, slavery, children and teenagers who are bullied for years, sexually, physically, emotionally abused, neglected, living in a household with a mum who is maybe abuses drugs, and there's violence. So that's the difference. It's multiple times. Now, obviously, when I review the treatment is actually pretty similar, but I think it's important that we understand the differences, and that'll become clear as I proceed. So it's estimated that approximately 15% of children and teenagers in the USA alone develop PTSD every year. And this is just for the US, but globally we know that this is a huge problem. It's estimated that 8 million children and adults in the United States alone have PTSD, just PTSD, not CPTSD, just PTSD, and that's pretty scary. So what exactly is it? So as we know from previous modules, and think back to Module 1 and especially Module 2 when we discussed toxic stress and ACEs, whenever we experience a traumatic, stressful, scary, frightening event, our body goes into stress danger mode because it wants to protect us, and it triggers the flight, fight, fight response. Now with PTSD and CPTSD, what happens is the wire in the brain gets stuck in the danger mode. It's kind of like that needle that's stuck on the record player. The areas that are affected in PTSD is the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And actually, there's a diagram in the article that will be accompanying this, which can be found on my website, www.traceymaxfield.com. And so what happens is all of these are part of the neural circuitry and kind of triggered the controls necessary for us to kind of respond appropriately to the danger and to the stimuli in our environment. So for example, the amygdala helps to process emotions and fear responses. The hippocampus controls appropriate responses to the environmental stimuli, so the amygdala does not go into stress mode unnecessarily. And then the ventromedial prefrontal cortex regulates the emotional responses by controlling the amygdala. Now in PTSD, so we know the amygdala is the big one, there's hyperactivity. And this hyperactivity, think of it vibrating, it triggers feelings of anxiety and panic and stress. And whenever it's reminded of the trauma, it just goes on to mega high alert. Think of it like an alarm going off. The hippocampus actually shrinks in size and it becomes hyperactive, which results then in them having difficulty understanding memories. So past memories, present memories, which one's right, which one's wrong. And also the ventromedial prefrontal cortex also shrinks, which then has difficulty in processing the environmental stimuli. And there's a saying, Lassoff wrote a great article, which I've referenced in my article, and he says the amygdala actually goes into a tizzy. So you're in mega overdrive all the time, and you have flashbacks and nightmares, and you'll see a person or an environment or an item, an object, a smell, music, something will trigger it, and then the brain just vibrates and you're in this flight, fight, fight mode. The difference with PTSD and CPTSD is that it goes beyond the fight, flight, fright mode, because remember, with CPTSD, it is something that is ongoing, so it takes place over months and years and years. And I think what's important to remember as well is that you may not actually even know you have it, and something may trigger it months later or even years later. There's so many people now that are maybe in their 30s and 40s and have lived with CPTSD for so long, and now they recognize what they're going through and receive appropriate treatment. And so what studies have shown is that the earlier we're able to recognize and start treatment of PTSD and CPTSD in children and teenagers, the better chance they have of going into recovery and actually healing well from it. And so, yes, they have 3 of the 5 responses. So we have the fight, we have the flight, we have the fright, or it's also called freeze, but we also have flop, fawn, and friend. So I'll explain. Let's say we have a teenager who has complex PTSD. Behaviors you're going to type C in with the fight: angry, aggressive outbursts, may bully others, they'll do self-preservation of all costs, may try to control others to try and enable them to take control of their lives. Their flight is panic and anxiety. It's wanting to get away from the danger. They will be unable to relax, unable to sit still, very edgy. The fright or freeze is the brain fog, the disassociation. They may feel lifeless, spaced out, that they don't belong. Flop or fawn. Now, the flop, as we know, is just literally like playing dead, playing unconscious, just totally spacing out. The fawn is overcaring, scared to speak out, They may be seen as a sucker, an easy target, or a people pleaser because they don't want to create any animosity, any angst. And then we have the friend, and that may seem really silly, but think about it. If you've been abused by a very, very long time by a trusted guardian or an adult figure, you end up befriending them. You actually believe what is happening to you is normal. You will protect the person at all costs. Think of they call it Stockholm Syndrome. So people are taken hostage, then they start supporting the hostage takers. They've befriended them. The same is true when you're dealing with someone that's going through this ongoing traumatic, stressful, horrendous experience. It's very, very common in children and teenagers who have undergone severe neglect or childhood abuse, which includes physical, emotional, psychological, social, sexual. Another good example of the friend would be if you think of I can't remember her name offhand, but she wrote a book. She was kidnapped from her bed and taken into the mountains in Colorado. And even though people saw her around town when she was with him, she protected him, and she was too scared or even felt that she could escape. And so it's those situations where they do befriend them, and you cannot criticize or judge them for that. It is called almost just like brainwashing, or it's survival mode. So what we know now, because more and more people are taking account of ACEs, especially ACE scores in children, is that 43% of kids have already experienced one traumatic event in their life before they become a teenager. And usually by the age of 18, most of them have experienced 2 or 3 traumatic events. Of those kids, let's say the 43% who've experienced a traumatic event before the age of 18, they anticipate about 6% of boys and 15% of girls who will then go on to develop PTSD. And what's important is, even if you have experienced a single horrific event or a series of horrific events, does not necessarily mean you will then develop PTSD or CPTSD. The likelihood of developing PTSD is based on many factors. It's actually the length of time and the degree and type of abuse. The current stress level and the ability to manage stress and what coping strategies the child or teenager has, the type of support system and network that the kid has, personality and previous coping strategies, family history, obviously the ACE score. Remember, the higher the ACE score, the more likelihood that they will have PTSD. A history of mental health issues, or they may have a pre-existing mental health disorder, or they may have a learning disability. All of those are going to play into whether or not this child or teenager could then go on to develop PTSD. So I've already mentioned that we know that abuse, survivor guilt, bullying, all of these can lead to PTSD, CPTSD. Even a child or a teenager who was involved in a hurricane or an earthquake or in a war zone, or a shooting, like a drive-by shooting, or drugs, depending on whether it was a single event or if it was multiple events. That's the difference, PTSD or CPTSD. Because with CPTSD, it goes on for a longer period of time. Remember, that's going to be more trauma. And so signs and symptoms are, they say, actually the same as adults. The only difference is, if it's very young children, they will exhibit more fearful and regressive behaviors and may enact the trauma through play rather than talking about it. So your common symptoms, which everyone is going to have: stress, anxiety, depression, given. Repeated memories of the trauma, right? That's flashbacks, that's nightmares, feeling on edge, emotional anxiety, You try to avoid anything that reminds you of the trauma, going places, people, a TV show, music, food, doesn't matter. You will avoid it at all costs. That's self-preservation. You will have an ongoing negative mood and fluctuating in moods. There'll be feelings of anger and shame and guilt. And you can actually have detachment. You detach yourself from others and the world and become more withdrawn. And we see this an awful lot in veterans. They don't participate in once enjoyed activities and able to experience hope. They do not express any positive comments, fixed belief that the world is unsafe. Remember, we've already reviewed stress and the signs and symptoms of anxiety and depression. Well, add these into the equation. And then the emotional and physical responses are the sleep changes and the appetite changes and the mood swings and the easily startled. And remember, the fright mode is on hyperdrive, so they're hypervigilant, so they won't be able to concentrate. Now, what we do know is that children and teenagers with PTSD and CPTSD do not do well at school, and so it's imperative that the school is involved in the treatment plan. So, as I said, CPTSD is from repeated trauma over months and years rather than just one single event. The difference between PTSD and CPTSD is that in CPTSD, because of the trauma it's caused to the brain over the length of time that this ongoing horrendous abuse has happened, is that there's a distortion of the person's core identity of who they are, and there's significant emotional dysregulation. Like, who am I and who do they trust? And is everyone like that? And is the world like that? And think of, living in a war zone. The World Health Organization has now just proved that every single child and teenager that has come from Syria or other war-torn countries and has sought refuge in Canada and the United States and Europe and in the UK, they're all to have mandatory EMDR, eye movement desensitization therapy, and CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, because both of them have been proved to be extremely successful with PTSD and CPTSD treatment. So what we're going to see in kids and teenagers with CPTSD is all the signs and symptoms I've just mentioned for PTSD, plus they're going to feel empty and damaged and worthless and helpless, and no one understands him or her, difficulty controlling emotions, up and down, flip-flop, withdrawal, ideation, self-harm, suicide ideation, including suicide attempts, distortions in relationships. They will not be able to maintain friendships, out-of-school activities. They'll be quite hostile with family, very hostile and distrustful of the world, and disassociation memory disturbances. Now, these are the two key symptoms. Disassociation memory disturbances are amnesic periods, time loss, blackouts, fugue episodes. Just space out and be gone and will not recall. And then disassociation process symptoms. That's where they have trance-like states, altered personality states, like what the heck is a different person, depersonalization, and switching behaviors and auditory hallucinations. And so you'll think maybe that they have dissociative identity disorder. It's not. It's their response to the trauma. CPTSD. And we know that dissociative identity disorder is also related to stress and toxic stress and ACEs and post-traumatic stress. And most of them also do have a PTSD or a CPTSD, but not to get confused. What we're finding is that the signs and symptoms of CPTSD almost mimic borderline personality disorder, and so that's why it is imperative that a very thorough assessment, diagnostic test, psychiatric test is done to determine is it CPTSD or borderline personality disorder? And in fact, in my next article and YouTube video, I will be discussing borderline personality disorder, so you can see how very close both of them are, and hence the need to have a qualified psychiatrist who specializes in this to do the diagnosis, because lots of family doctors are not able to recognize these and will frequently misdiagnose. So that's why it is imperative that you follow up with a psychiatrist, and every single child and teenager and young adult should see a psychiatrist. So treatment options for PTSD and CPTSD are the same. Medications. Now, medications are dependent upon the doctor and the psychiatrist, but they could give them anti-anxiety medications, maybe an antidepressant, mood stabilizer, maybe a sedative. They're usually short-term, or they may be longer-term depending on the severity of the trauma. What that's going to do is just kind of maintain an even keel, so then you can proceed with therapy, which is going to be tough to begin with. And so the two specific therapeutic interventions which have been approved by the World Health Organization, and which actually veterans are using now with remarkable results, are CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's going to teach the child or teenager ways to replace the negative thinking and thought process with positive ones. And over time, the behavioral strategy should desensitize the child or teenager to the traumatic event and to the triggers, which consequently reduces the anxiety and fear and then helps the depression. And then EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy. And this is where they combine cognitive therapy with directed eye movements as they're talking about or viewing the traumatic event. With very young children, as I've said, play therapy extremely helpful. And then there's also group therapy or support groups. They now have created support groups and group therapy where children or teenagers get together, and having that peer support and guidance, and also having a group of teenagers who've gone through similar situations, it actually helps enormously. It empowers the teenager that it's not their fault, that they're not alone, that there's others like them, they befriend them, and it helps them through the therapy process. And I can't stress that enough. It's, if you can find a support group or a group therapy meeting, please encourage your teenager to go there. They will find it significantly beneficial. Other ways, individual therapy. I think if, for example, the child also, or the teenager has a learning disability or a cognitive issue, or already a diagnosed mental disorder, remember treatment and therapy has to continue with that. Also, PTSD and CPTSD are sometimes what we call dual diagnosis, because alcohol and drug abuse, I'm very sad to say, is very, very common, because it's a way to deal with the pain and the turmoil and the flashbacks and the memories, and so they dull their brain. And so it's not uncommon that you also have to maybe treat more specifically the teenager or the young adult for a alcohol or substance use problem as well. And now something that actually they are now using in schools, which is awesome, is pet therapy. They have found, after giving veterans and EMTs that were off on extended leave with stress due to PTSD or CPTSD, they found that specially trained therapy dogs helped enormously. And what it does, it's not only is it comfort and companionship, like it's a dog, but they assist with medical crisis. They provide treatment-related assistance. They're specially trained. They offer safety and security. They can safely awaken a child or teenager when they're having flashbacks. They can assist with depression, anxiety, emotional overload, and they also are a companion. Also, it will reduce the risk of bullying significantly. So, how do we help a child or teenager who has PTSD or CPTSD. And actually all of these can be used with any person that is living with this. So the first thing is, but you've got to be patient. You've got to reassure them that they have done nothing wrong, that it's not their problem. It's compassion, non-judgment, understanding, show love. I kind of go through these every time when I'm talking about how to help. Do not criticize or tease any regressive behavior, such as they may suddenly start wetting the bed, or they may need to sleep with their favorite toy or blanket, or sleep with the light on. This is all coping mechanisms. You must be there for them. You're not going to force and push them into reliving the memories, but when they do, you validate and listen, and you praise them and you encourage them. Try and keep to a routine and their schedule as quickly as possible. As hard as it may seem, getting them back into the swing of things and back to school is going to be a huge help in normalizing life. You need to follow up with school because they need to be very aware of what the triggers are, how they can help when the child or teenager needs time out. You're going to talk with siblings, right, and family and friends, and let them know. Give the medications, be alert for side effects, follow up with all therapy, engage in therapy yourself. You may need to go to therapy with the child or teenager or have your own family therapy, but follow through in doing that. It's small leaps and gains, but it does work when followed consistently. Follow up with doctor's appointments, psychiatric appointments, other things, a healthy lifestyle, right? Diet, rest, sleep, exercise, social activities, but not and family activities, so they feel loved and part of a unit, but not overwhelming. They don't do well in crowds and noise and busyness. Do not expect big family gatherings. Go slow. Do one-on-one things. So it encourages the child or teenager to trust you and to share things with you. I think the other thing is, because these kids do have a tendency to self-harm, be alert for that. Also, suicidal risk. So know the warning signs of suicide, and kind of you need to be there and be checking in on your child, and checking up, but indiscreetly, if you know what I mean. Are they online? Who are they talking to? What chat rooms are they going to? Again, because we don't want them to get misinformation about what they have. We don't want them checking suicide websites, self-harm websites. We also don't want them to fall victim to cyberbullying. So be alert to their friends. Any changes in friends' behavior, activities, dress, hairstyle, all of this could indicate potential drug abuse, alcohol abuse. Maybe they're smoking pot or smoking cigarettes, engaging in risky behaviors, self-harm, suicide ideation, and also bullying. It's very common that kids who have PTSD or CPTSD become victims of a bully, but also they bully themselves. So that's something that you really need to be cognizant of. They could become the classic bully victim, which isn't very good, because then they get quite nasty and vengeful. You also want to, I think, just be available, encourage mindfulness, journaling, expressing thoughts and feelings through music or drama or play or art or poetry or writing. Healing is going to take time, especially if it was years and years and years of, let's say, sexual abuse by a trusted adult. So, it's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen in 6 months, but you will see with CBT and EMDR that there is progress is made. And as progress is made and the child or teenager feels more confident and better supported and less anxious, that will empower them to move on to the next step and then start kind of regaining their lives and controlling what goes on in their life and what they'd like to do. So certainly it's a very overwhelming disorder. and there's a lot of information, but please, there's even more detailed information in the article that will accompany this on my website. Next week, as I said, I will be discussing borderline personality disorder, and you can see how the two are so closely related. And a little bit of housekeeping, please. If you'd like to subscribe to my YouTube channel, I would love it. Click the button below, enter your email. And so that's it. I apologize. This has been a very lengthy video, but a very necessary one just because of the complexity of the disorders. Thank you.